The wooden chair beneath me was ice cold, but my hands didn't shake. Across the courtroom, my husband, Elias Caldwell, smiled like a man who had already buried his wife alive. "You'll never touch my money again," he whispered, smug and certain. Behind him sat his mistress Kendra and his mother, both wearing victory on their faces. They thought this was my funeral. But what they didn't know was that the letter in the judge's hands wasn't a plea, it was a death warrant for Elias's perfect life. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by someone who swore to love you forever. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a divorce story. It's the story of how a quiet housewife, someone everyone dismissed as weak, turned the courtroom into a battlefield and her husband's own crimes into his downfall. My name is Serena Caldwell, and for 8 years I lived in a mansion that never felt like mine. Every wall was white and perfect. Every corner smelled like Elias's cologne and my own silence. People thought I had everything, a rich husband, a beautiful home, a life without worry. But they didn't see how my life had shrunk, inch by inch, until it fit inside his wallet. When we first met, Elias was charming in the kind of way that made you forget to breathe. He had this effortless confidence, the type that fills a room before he even walks in. I was working at a small marketing agency in Manhattan back then. I loved my job, tight deadlines, brainstorming sessions, the thrill of seeing my ideas come alive in a storefront. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Elias used to visit our office as a client, bringing flowers, remembering small details about everyone. For me, it was always lilies. "They remind me of you," he said once, his voice smooth as silk, elegant, clean, uncomplicated. I didn't realize then that uncomplicated was exactly what he wanted in a wife. When we got married, I thought I had stepped into a fairy tale. Elias moved me into his family's Upper East Side estate with marble floors that echoed like cathedrals, and a chandelier that could blind you if you stood beneath it too long. His mother, Dorothea, was there every week in perfect posture, perfect pearls and eyes that scanned me like a customs officer looking for contraband. At first, I tried so hard to please her. I wore the right dresses, smiled through her critiques about my middle-class taste in cooked recipes she suggested from her society magazines. But nothing I did ever pleased her. "You're sweet," she'd say, pressing a manicured hand to my arm, "but Elias needs a woman who elevates him. Someone with refinement." I laughed it off the first few times, convincing myself she'd come around eventually. But then came the dinners where she'd compliment other women in front of Elias. That Kendra Sterling. What an accomplished young designer, comes from such a fine family, and I began to understand. I would never be enough for Dorothea Caldwell. Elias didn't defend me. He never did. Instead, he'd pat my hand under the table and whisper, "She just wants what's best for us, honey." I told myself it was love. I told myself he meant well. But I was wrong. After the wedding, Elias insisted I quit my job. "You don't need to work anymore," he said, slicing his steak into perfect pieces. "I make enough for both of us. You should focus on making our home beautiful." I hesitated. I liked my independence, but the way he said for both of us made me feel guilty for wanting more. So I quit. It started small, the kind of control that hides inside good intentions. Elias took over our finances for convenience. He set up a household card for me so you wouldn't have to worry about bills. He asked me to text him receipts just to stay organized. And before I realized it, I was asking permission to buy groceries. When I spent $8 at a coffee shop with a friend, he circled it on the statement like a teacher grading homework. "You have to be careful, Serena," he said softly. "Little things add up. Be smart." He was right, I thought. Smart wives didn't argue. So I stopped buying new clothes. I stopped meeting friends. I stopped asking questions. Every no from Elias was wrapped in kindness like a chain dipped in honey. And then there was the Sunday dinners, Dorothea's weekly performance of judgment in class. The roast would be overcooked, the flowers in the wrong arrangement, my dress too casual. One evening, she leaned across the table with that icy smile and said, "You know, Elias, I met the most charming girl at the country club. Kendra Sterling, an interior designer. You should see her work, so sophisticated." Elias's fork paused midair. "Maybe she could help with the guest rooms," he said. My throat went dry. I had spent weeks decorating those rooms, picking the colors, sewing the curtains myself, even staying up late to polish the wood. But I smiled anyway. "That sounds lovely." A week later, Kendra Sterling walked into my life wearing a red coat and confidence that reeked of perfume and conquest. She was everything. I wasn't bold, stylish, fearless. She moved through my home like she already owned it, pointing out flaws I hadn't noticed, brushing her manicured fingers over furniture I'd chosen. Such potential, she said with a soft laugh. You've made it cozy, Serena. But Elias deserves something a bit more elevated. Elias smiled at her the way he used to smile at me. That night I stood in the kitchen pretending to clean dishes. I'd already washed my reflection warping in the stainless steel sink. I could hear them laughing in the next room. My husband and his designer. My replacement. After that, things began to unravel fast. Elias started coming home late, always smelling like a different perfume. He'd claim work dinners, client meetings, urgent calls. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But lies have a smell, you just have to live with them long enough to recognize it. The proof came by accident. A restaurant receipt in his jacket pocket. Champagne, lobster, dessert for 2. The total was more than my monthly allowance. I sat on the bed staring at it, my hands shaking my chest tight. I could hear the clock ticking in the hall, each second carving into my skin. That night, when he came home smiling, I asked how his meeting went. Productive, he said, loosening his tie. You know how clients can be. I smiled. I do. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because anger without strategy is just noise, and I'd been quiet for too long to waste my first scream. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I watched Elias sleep beside me, peaceful and unbothered, his hand resting over his phone. I slipped out of bed, dressed in jeans and a baseball cap, and drove to his office downtown. I parked across the street and waited. My heart was beating so hard it hurt. Around 11, Elias appeared laughing with Kendra beside him. She wore that same red coat. They got into his car, her hand brushing his arm like she owned it. They drove to the Caldwell Refuge, the same restaurant where he'd once told me we couldn't afford to eat anymore. Through the window, I watched him pull out her chair, touch her face, kiss her hand. I didn't cry. I just stared, memorizing everything. By the time they finished lunch, I knew this wasn't just an affair. It was a replacement plan, complete with approval from his mother and a script I wasn't meant to survive. I drove home, my stomach hollow. When Elias came back that night, he kissed me on the forehead and said, You seem tired. Maybe take a nap tomorrow. Don't worry so much. That was the moment I realized he didn't see me as a person anymore. I was background noise in his perfect life, but he'd forgotten something crucial. Even background noise can start an earthquake. I didn't know it then, but everything was about to change. 2 days after that lunch, I stopped pretending to be asleep when Elias left the house. I waited until his car disappeared from the driveway, then went straight to his home office. The door was locked as always. He thought he was clever, hiding the key under the lamp on his desk. I had seen him do it months before. When the lock clicked open, my heart pounded so hard it felt like a drum in my throat. The room smelled like his cologne, clean, metallic, and sharp. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, striping the floor like prison bars. I started with the drawers, neatly labeled folders, contracts, clients, invoices. At first it all looked legitimate until I found a thin folder at the bottom, marked personal accounts. Inside were bank statements from accounts I had never seen, numbers that made my stomach twist. 6-figure deposits from shell companies with meaningless names. Transfers between accounts every few days. Cash withdrawals that could have bought houses. He had told me I didn't need my own savings, that he would take care of me. Turns out he was taking care of everyone but me. I took photos of everything page after page, my phone trembling in my hand. Then I found another file labeled Caldwell Holdings, LLC. I'd heard him mention that name once when he thought I wasn't listening. He said it belonged to a client, but the document said otherwise. The company was his, and through it, he owned multiple properties across the city. Each one had been bought by one company and sold to another, both linked to him. Money in, money out, squeaky clean on paper. Except now I had the paper. At the very back of the drawer was a folder titled Asset Protection Strategy. It was full of letters from lawyers talking about offshore accounts and tax havens. I didn't understand all the legal terms, but I understood one thing: Elias was hiding money. A lot of it. I heard a car door slam outside and nearly dropped the folder. My pulse jumped. I shoved everything back exactly where I'd found it, locked the office, and barely made it to the kitchen before Elias walked in. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, "You look pale. Everything okay?" I handed him a sandwich, just tired. He didn't notice the way my hands shook. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I kept seeing the folder's title glowing in my mind. Asset Protection Strategy. Protection for him, not me. By morning, my fear had hardened into focus. I called an old friend, Chloe Hayes. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since I'd quit my job and slipped into Elias's gilded cage. But she had been an accountant even back then, and I trusted her. "Serena," she said when she answered. "Wow, it's been forever. How are you?" "I need your help," I whispered, "and I need you not to tell anyone." We met that afternoon at a quiet coffee shop far from Midtown, the kind of place with cracked leather seats and a jukebox that still played Sinatra. I brought my phone every photo I'd taken. Chloe scrolled through the images, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "Where did you get these?" "They're Elias's business files." She looked up alarmed. "Serena, some of these transactions, this looks like money laundering." I blinked. "Money laundering? Like crime shows?" She nodded grimly. "Yes. He's running dirty money through real estate. See these deposits? No legitimate business moves cash like this. If the wrong people find out, you could be in danger." The room tilted slightly. "What should I do?" She hesitated, then scribbled a name and number on a napkin. "Detective Major, White Collar Crimes Unit. Tell him I sent you. But be careful. If Elias even suspects you've seen this, he won't think twice about silencing you." The word silencing stuck to my skin like cold sweat. That night, Elias came home humming. He had that glow he always wore after being with Kendra. "We should book a trip soon," he said, tossing his keys on the counter. "Maybe the Maldives." I smiled faintly. "That sounds lovely." He kissed me goodnight. I waited until his breathing slowed before slipping out of bed and staring at him in the dark. The man who once said he loved me had become a stranger, and now that stranger was a criminal. The next morning I drove to the precinct. Detective Major was nothing like I expected. Mid-40s, gray hair at the temples, a patient kind of calm. He spread my photos across his desk like pieces of a puzzle. "This is solid," he said. "Mrs. Caldwell, your husband isn't just laundering money. He's skimming from his own partners. That's dangerous." "What kind of partners?" "The kind who don't go to court. Drug money, most likely. If you're right, he's been using his construction company to clean millions." My voice was barely a whisper. "What happens now? If you cooperate, we can build a case. But it won't be easy." "I'll do it," I said before I even thought about it. He leaned forward. "Are you sure? People who play both sides often get hurt." I met his gaze. "I'm already hurt." 3 days later, I sat across from him again, this time with Assistant District Attorney Ada Solar. Together, they laid out a deal. I would become a confidential informant. I'd help gather evidence. In return, I'd get immunity protection and the right to keep assets tied to Elias's legitimate earnings. It was the first real power I'd held in years. They trained me quickly. How to hide a recorder in a button. How to plant a micro camera without notice. How to act the part of a woman still in love with her husband. For 2 months, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was the obedient wife, cooking his meals, smiling at his lies, nodding at his excuses. By night, I transferred data-labeled audio files and met with Detective Major in unmarked cars. I recorded everything. Elias bragging about clients who paid in cash, boasting about washing $500,000 a month, complaining that the bear brace rages was getting greedy. I even captured him laughing about how he'd hide the affair money from the IRS. The first time I played that recording for Detective Major, he looked up from his notes and said quietly, "Mrs. Caldwell, you just took down your husband." It didn't feel like victory yet. It felt like survival. The night before the divorce hearing, I sat at the kitchen table with a single white envelope in front of me. Inside was my letter to the judge, a detailed summary of everything I'd done, signed, dated, and backed by evidence filed with the district attorney's office. I sealed it knowing that once it left my hands, there would be no going back. Elias came home late again, smelling of scotch and Kendra's perfume. "Tomorrow's the big day," he said, grinning. "After that, you can stop pretending." He meant pretending to be his wife. I smiled. Funny, I was thinking the same thing. He laughed, poured himself a drink, and went upstairs. I stayed at the table watching the envelope in the dim kitchen light. Tomorrow everything would change. Elias thought he was walking into a victory. He didn't know he was walking into his own arrest warrant. And as I turned off the lights that night, I whispered into the dark, "You taught me that knowledge is power, Elias. You just never imagined I'd use it against you." The morning light slanted through the kitchen blinds, turning the marble counters gold. It looked peaceful, too peaceful for what was coming. I had spent months pretending, months smiling through lies. And now every gesture, every soft-spoken "yes, dear" was part of my war. Elias believed I had surrendered. That belief was my greatest weapon. He started his final campaign the week before the divorce hearing. Suddenly, everything had to be official documents, valuations, bank statements. He thought I didn't understand. He paraded his lawyers through our home discussing assets like I wasn't standing there. She doesn't need much, I overheard him tell one of them. She's never been ambitious. She'll settle for comfort. Comfort. As if I'd be content with crumbs from his corruption. Kendra visited that week too, under the guise of finalizing the interior work. She brought her smug perfume and her sharper tongue. I remember her standing by the window, sunlight turning her hair gold, her tone dripping sugar. Elias just wants closure, Serena. You've had such a nice life. Maybe it's time to let him be happy. I smiled as if her words didn't cut straight through my chest. You're right, I said softly. Everyone deserves happiness, even those who build it on stolen money. Her smile faltered just for a second. She didn't understand what I meant, but she would. Every night that week, I rehearsed my role. The obedient, docile wife, head bowed, voice small. I needed Elias confident, arrogant, and distracted. I needed him to underestimate me right up until the judge opened that envelope. Detective Major called the night before the hearing. Everything's ready, he said. Your testimony, the evidence chain, the cooperation agreement, it's all been filed under seal. Once Judge Wallace reads that letter, it's over. Not yet, I whispered. It's only over when he knows he's lost. That night, Elias was pacing the living room, talking on the phone. Yes, she'll sign. She's too scared to fight back, he said, pouring himself another drink. I stood in the doorway, watching the reflection of his arrogance in the glass. He hung up, turned and smiled at me. Big day tomorrow. Don't embarrass yourself, Serena. Just let the lawyers handle it. I walked closer, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. Of course. You've always handled everything, haven't you? He grinned. That's what I do best. As he walked past me, I whispered, let's hope you're still smiling tomorrow. He didn't hear me. The next morning, the house was silent, except for the sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor. I wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what was necessary. I looked small, forgettable. That was intentional. People dismiss women who don't look like threats. At the courthouse, Elias arrived in his expensive navy suit, laughing with his team of attorneys. Kendra trailed behind him, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread. Dorothea, of course, was already there, whispering to the press about family dignity. I kept my eyes on the floor, clutching my purse, the one that carried the recorder Detective Major had given me, just in case Elias decided to confess something foolish in the hallway. He didn't. He was too busy enjoying his moment. Inside the courtroom, Elias's lead lawyer strutted through opening statements, like it was theater. Mrs. Caldwell has lived a privileged life, he said. She contributed nothing financially, holds no education beyond high school, and seeks an excessive share of Mr. Caldwell's earnings. I wanted to laugh. High school, I had a degree in marketing, one Elias had convinced me to bury under domestic silence. They brought out charts, spreadsheets, witnesses, all rehearsed lies. Dorothea took the stand, talking about how I never tried to fit in, how Elias had done his best to elevate me. I watched her pearls tremble slightly as she spoke the only sign of fear she'd ever shown. Kendra sat in the gallery, her lips curved into a delicate smile, watching the woman she'd helped destroy take her final bow. My lawyer, Mr. Rohr, looked uneasy. He didn't know what I'd done. Only Detective Major and 8A Solar did. They'd instructed me to keep it that way to protect the chain of custody, to keep the shock intact. So when my lawyer stammered through weak objections, I stayed silent. Every insult, every lie, every calculated humiliation, I absorbed it, because this was their last performance, and mine was still to come. By midday, Elias's lawyers had shredded what was left of my image. When the judge called for recess, I excused myself to the restroom. Inside the empty stall, I finally allowed myself one deep shaking breath. In the mirror, I looked pale but steady. My reflection didn't belong to a broken woman. It belonged to someone who'd been reforged in silence and fire. I whispered to the mirror, let them finish their show. The curtain's about to fall. When I walked back into that courtroom, Elias caught my eye and smirked. He thought it was pity. It wasn't. It was goodbye. Tomorrow, when Judge Wallace read that letter, he would finally understand who I really was. But first he needed one last chance to believe he had already won. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and tension when we reconvened after recess. Elias's lawyers were grinning. They thought I was defeated. I sat down quietly, folding my hands in my lap. I'd learned that silence unnerves powerful men. They mistake it for weakness right before it swallows them whole. Judge Wallace, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, you've remained unusually calm through this process. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed to closing statements? Elias's lawyer leaned forward, clearly hoping I'd decline. I smiled faintly. Not at the moment, Your Honor. He relaxed, thinking I'd just sealed my own coffin. Elias smirked from his seat beside him, whispering something to his mother. I could guess the words, "She'll crumble soon." What they didn't know was that my words were already written, sealed in the envelope. Judge Wallace would open at the end of the hearing. The afternoon dragged on. They dissected my life like vultures. Elias's financial expert described me as economically dependent. Dorothea added that I never understood the pressures of success. Kendra, sitting in the back row, pretended to dab tears from her eyes. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so vile. When my turn finally came, my lawyer called me to the stand. My palms were cold, but my heartbeat was steady. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, "how would you describe your marriage?" I took a breath. Quiet. Quiet. Yes, I said, meeting Elias's eyes, because silence was expected of me. I let that hang in the air just long enough to make him shift in his seat. My lawyer asked about finances, about control. I answered carefully, never lying, but never revealing too much. I wasn't allowed my own account, I said softly. He said it would make me feel safe. I suppose he was right. Safety looks a lot like captivity when you don't know you're in a cage. There was a faint murmur in the gallery. Even the judge's pen paused. Elias leaned toward his attorney, whispering furiously. When the questioning ended, I returned to my seat. Elias's team immediately called for dismissal of emotional testimony irrelevant to financial proceedings. Judge Wallace raised an eyebrow. "Denied," she said curtly. "I find Mrs. Caldwell's remarks very relevant." Elias clenched his jaw. I saw the vein at his temple twitch. By 4 p.m., the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. Every fake smile was cracking. Elias's arrogance had shifted to irritation, then to rage. When he took the stand to clarify the financial structure of his companies, he overplayed his hand. He spoke too much. "I built everything myself," he said, voice sharp. "Every account, every transfer, every shell company. Serena had nothing to do with it." There it was, the confession gift wrapped. His lawyer tried to interrupt, but Elias pushed on his ego too swollen to stop. "You think she could even spell LLC?" "Please." She was lucky I let her keep her jewelry. A low gasp spread through the room. Even Dorothea's face faltered. Judge Wallace frowned. "Mr. Caldwell, I'd advise you to control your tone." Elias straightened, realizing too late what he'd revealed. His attorney muttered something under his breath. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply watched him unravel thread by thread. When the judge announced, "We'll reconvene tomorrow for the final ruling," Elias exhaled like a man certain of victory. He turned to me as we stood. "Guess you'll finally be free, huh? You should thank me." I looked up at him, my expression unreadable. "I already have." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll see." He laughed, shaking his head. Always the mystery. He brushed past me, his cologne trailing behind like arrogance made visible. That night back at the house, he was almost kind. He poured 2 glasses of wine, saying, "No hard feelings after tomorrow, right?" I held my glass, but didn't drink. "Of course not. I just hope you sleep well." He grinned. "I always do." But I didn't sleep at all. I lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the windows, the city murmuring below my mind, a storm of calm precision. By dawn, I was ready. I placed the final sealed envelope in my purse, the one labeled for Judge Wallace. Inside it was everything: transcripts, recordings, offshore documents, and a signed letter confirming my cooperation with the district attorney's office. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Detective Major texted one line, "We're in position. Once she opens it, it's go time." I stared out the window at the pale Manhattan skyline. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not safe, not happy, but free. Elias had built his empire on secrets. He was about to learn what happened when a woman he dismissed as uncomplicated learned to weaponize the truth. Tomorrow his world would burn, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger, just watch it collapse under the weight of his own lies. The courtroom was colder that morning. Maybe it was just me, or maybe the air itself sensed what was coming. I arrived before anyone else, sitting in the same wooden chair where I'd spent hours pretending to be powerless. My palms rested on my knees, perfectly still. I'd rehearsed this moment so many times I could almost feel the weight of it pressing against my skin. Elias walked in with his usual confidence, his lawyers trailing behind him like a parade. His tie was perfect, his smirk sharper than ever. "Morning, sweetheart," he said as he passed. "Let's try to keep this civil." "Of course," I murmured. "Civility is important before an execution." He didn't hear me. Behind him, Kendra entered, dressed in a crisp blue suit that screamed money and self-importance. She smiled at Elias, then at me, slow, triumphant curve of her red lips. Dorothea followed, her pearls glinting under the courthouse lights, her face carved into an expression of smug victory. Judge Wallace entered, and the room fell silent. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked between us. "We'll resume with closing statements," she said. Elias's lead attorney stood first. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has been more than generous. Mrs. Caldwell has lived a life of privilege without contribution, without sacrifice." He simply asked that the settlement reflect fairness. His tone was smooth, measured, rehearsed, but behind the polished phrasing was pure cruelty. He continued, "She has no assets of her own, no education beyond high school, no professional history. She seeks to profit from a marriage she brought nothing to." Elias nodded along, his arms crossed. He didn't even look at me because in his mind I no longer existed as a person, just a detail in a transaction he was closing out. When the lawyer sat down, Elias leaned toward him and whispered something that made them both laugh. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I'd waited too long for this moment to waste it on emotion. Then Judge Wallace turned to my lawyer. "Mr. Rohr, do you have anything further?" My lawyer hesitated, then stood. His voice trembled slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. My client has prepared a written statement for the court's consideration." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the white envelope. Elias's smile twitched. Kendra straightened in her seat. Dorothea's eyes narrowed, tracking every movement. "What is this?" Elias demanded. Judge Wallace held up her hand. "Proceed." Mr. Rohr handed her the envelope. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sound of the seal breaking. The judge unfolded the letter, slowly scanning the first page. Her eyes moved back and forth, and something in her face shifted. The corners of her mouth began to lift. Then she let out a soft laugh, low at first, then louder. It filled the entire courtroom, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Oh," she said, placing the paper down and removing her glasses. "This is good. This is very good." Elias's lawyer frowned. "Your Honor." Judge Wallace looked at Elias. "Mr. Caldwell, according to this letter, your wife has been working with the FBI and the district attorney's office for the past 2 months as a cooperating witness in a federal money laundering investigation." The words hit like a thunderclap. Elias shot to his feet. "That's ridiculous. She doesn't know anything about my business." "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," the judge said sharply. "According to the evidence attached, your company, Caldwell Holdings, LLC, has been laundering drug money through real estate transactions. And you've been skimming from your criminal partners." The color drained from his face. His lawyer whispered something, but Elias didn't seem to hear. Kendra's hand flew to her mouth. "What is she talking about?" she whispered, looking at him in disbelief. The judge's voice cut through the chaos. "Ms. Sterling, you may wish to retain counsel of your own. It appears many of the gifts you received, jewelry, travel vehicles, were purchased with laundered funds. That makes you at minimum an accessory." Kendra's composure shattered. No, I didn't know, Elias. Tell them I didn't know." Dorothea stood abruptly. "This is absurd. My son is a respected businessman. This woman is lying." Judge Wallace's expression turned cold. "Mrs. Caldwell, Sr., sit down. The NYPD Major Case Squad is waiting outside to execute the arrest warrant. And for the record, the evidence was not provided by your daughter-in-law. It was verified independently by law enforcement." I could feel every eye in the room on me, but I didn't gloat. I simply sat there calm and quiet, watching the empire Elias had built crumble like dust. He turned to me, face white with fury. "You think you've won? You've doomed yourself. You don't know who those people are." I met his gaze evenly. "I know exactly who you are." He took a step towards me before 2 officers appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Elias Caldwell," one said firmly, "you're under arrest for money laundering, tax fraud, and conspiracy." The sound of metal cuffs snapping shut echoed through the room. Elias's expensive suit looked absurd against the gleam of handcuffs. Kendra began to cry. Dorothea slumped into her seat, her perfect posture gone. Judge Wallace cleared her throat. "This proceeding is hereby suspended pending criminal prosecution. Mrs. Serena Caldwell, as a cooperating witness, you will retain all verified legitimate assets. The remainder will be seized." Elias struggled as they led him away. "You'll regret this, Serena." I stood as the officers escorted him past. I already did for 8 years. He stopped just long enough to look back at me, rage, disbelief, and something like fear flickering in his eyes. Then he was gone. The room was silent again, except for the clicking of the judge's pen and Kendra's muffled sobs. I turned, gathered my purse, and walked out. The November wind hit me like a baptism. Cold, clean, alive. Outside the courthouse, the world kept moving. Horns blaring, people rushing by, unaware that one woman had just turned her own trial into a takedown. I took a deep breath and felt the first hint of freedom bloom in my chest. Elias had always said knowledge was power. He just never imagined I'd use mine to destroy him. And as I stepped into the sunlight, I smiled not the polite smile he'd trained me to wear, but the real one. The kind that comes when you finally stop being afraid. I didn't go home right away. The mansion on the Upper East Side wasn't mine anymore. It had never really been. Every inch of that place smelled like Elias, like control disguised as comfort. So instead I walked. Down Fifth Avenue past glass storefronts reflecting the morning light, past people who would never know that behind one courthouse door, a man's empire had collapsed. My phone buzzed. It was Detective Major. "It's done. Caldwell's in custody. Federal charges will follow within the week. You did good, Mrs. Caldwell." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "No, detective. I just told the truth." But the truth is never that simple. The truth cuts both ways. By the time I reached the small apartment the state had arranged for me, a temporary safe house, I felt the exhaustion sink into my bones. I kicked off my heels, sat on the couch, and stared at the folder the ADA had handed me that morning. It contained the full cooperation agreement, immunity, asset protection, and a percentage of the seized funds as a reward. 40% of what had once been Elias's empire. For the first time in years, my name was on the deed, my own name. Serena Caldwell, soon to be Serena something else. I opened the window and let the cold air fill the room. Somewhere out there, Kendra was probably hiring lawyers. Dorothea was hiding from the press, and Elias was sitting in a holding cell, replaying every moment, trying to figure out where I'd beaten him. He'd never understand. It wasn't the FBI or the documents or even the recordings that destroyed him. It was me, the woman he taught to be silent, the woman who learned to weaponize silence. And yet, deep down a whisper of unease crept in. Because when Detective Major had mentioned the name Brace the Bear Rages, I saw something flicker in his eyes, respect and fear. Elias had been laundering money for men who didn't forgive betrayal. If Elias talked, if he gave them my name, I closed the window. The air outside suddenly felt less like freedom and more like a warning. I wasn't naive anymore. Revenge never ends neatly, it leaves embers glowing in the dark. But as I stood there looking out over the city that had once swallowed me whole, I knew one thing for sure: I'd never be the victim again. And if the ghosts Elias left behind ever came looking for me, they'd find I'd learned a thing or two about survival. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone tried to break you, this story is for you. People like Elias think they hold all the power until the truth walks in wearing a calm smile. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to fight for your own freedom. Because trust me, this isn't the end. The past has a way of finding you even when you think you've escaped. And when it does, you'll see just how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine.